Hello guys, Art-Teeves here. In this video, I'll show you the process of modeling the stylized Rotunda House in 3ds Max 2024, unwrapping it in Rizom, and texturing it in Substance Painter. Let's get started. When it comes to plugins and scripts, I only use the Loop Regularizer script for 3ds Max. In Substance Painter, I rely on some preset crunches and a free material made by Fred Taylor. I've mentioned that matte in one of my previous videos. It's pretty basic, but allows us to play with gradients, baked light and many other settings without creating multiple fill layers. I'll provide the link to it in the description. Let's get started. I didn't use any references for this model. It was just a spontaneous idea to place a rotunda on the top of the house. The design is quite unusual. There is no hatch or staircase, but well, it is what it is. The house is modeled as a single static object. Nothing opens or moves, and there is no animation. It's designed as an overly detailed static prop. The model has 6.7K polygons and roughly the same number of vertices, which is quite high. Typically, we aim to keep such objects under 5K polygons, especially for static assets that don't move or interact with game mechanics. I started with a 32-sided cylinder for the base. That's a lot, but it allows for 4 sides per door and each of the 3 windows, with 4 polygons between each opening for spacing. For the roof, I used the 64-sided cylinder to achieve reasonably smooth curves at its base. I began with the most challenging part, the lower module. Its complexity comes from the need to cut windows and a door into it without ruining the shading or creating odd artifacts. We want to avoid adding excessive geometry, so the corners of the openings are handled with a single chamfer. When designing houses like this one, consider how they'll be used in a game scene. For strategy games, optimization is clearly the priority. For indie projects, think about the angles from which the building will be viewed. Don't add details where they won't be seen. For example, if we're looking at this house from the side or below, we'd never know whether there is a hatch on the upper platform. Initially, I modeled just one window. Like the door, its corners were given single chamfers. Once I achieved the desired shape, I separated the corresponding module from the model for duplication. Since there are 4 windows, I rotated the module by 90 degrees. The model occupies 4 polygons, a design choice I accounted for when setting the cylinder's side count. For strategy game models, details like the inner parts of the window frames are better painted onto the glass texture. For action games, MMOs or indie projects, I'd consider making the lower model feel inhabited, while the upper part could be modeled as I did in this project. Generally, in 2025, creating buildings that characters can't enter feels like poor design. I applied a single chamfer to the frames and other elements. Later, I created the inner details and aligned their edges to local axis to avoid shading artifacts. Finally, I broke up straight lines and adjusted vertices to give the window frames a slightly bent, worn look. Since we aren't using UV stacking, we could leverage this to add unique character to each window, though I didn't do that, probably a missed opportunity. After detaching, duplicating and reattaching the window segment to the model, I noticed a few unwelded vertices. I fixed them using the collapse tool and aligned the base of the building to the main axis. It's worth noting that I didn't use a traditional high-to-low polybaking workflow for this model. Of course, we could have used sculpting tools to make the window edges more organic if we had gone that route. In this case, we relied on mid-poly technique, creating something in between, not fully low poly, but not high poly either. This speeds up the workflow, but adds some unnecessary polygons. Overall, we can manually adjust vertices to mimic the imperfections that sculpting would provide. Remember, it's crucial to carefully plan the goals for your modeling. Specifically, create a blockout, consider the angles from which viewers will see your model, and determine the desired level of detail. Many elements can simply be painted on, saving effort on detailed geometry. It is also important to rotate the model now and then and observe it in both perspective and orthographic projections to understand its curves and evaluate the shading. Finally, you can use the selection panel to remove some trees and angons, and also use the 3ds Max's XU tool to scan your model for some open edges. I kept a significant number of triangles in the model. They are necessary, particularly for creating smooth transitions between the 32-sided cylinder and the 64-sided roof. It's usually the best practice to place triangles on flat surfaces. The first lower roof of the house's base tier is created as follows. I start with a 64-sided cylinder, double the size of the first floor, select its bottom edge and turn it into an editable spline using the Create Shape from Selection button. I convert the resulting shape into an editable spline. The 64 sides gives us 56 polygons, distributed as 7 polygons between each of the 8 roof ridges. I plan to use this editable spline as a loft object. The top of the roof needs to be flat, while the bottom gets a curve shaped with soft selection. I adjust the soft selection parameters and observe how the silhouette of the first curve changes. The loft can switch between multiple shapes. I start with my deformed spline and transition to a flat circle. Then I adjust the loft's curve to shape the roof. To avoid the sharp transition, I set the curve point to soft. For a more refined approach, we could manually move all the points without soft selection, creating multiple shapes for a smoother transition. Once the loft is complete, I adjusted lower points using an FFD 4x4 modifier. This step can be refined for hours to achieve increasingly polished shapes. I am satisfied with the result though. I slightly raised the roof above the door. You could also raise it above the windows and add a wave-like curve. Originally, I envisioned placing this house into a small oceanside scene. I give the roof some thickness, expand the upper part of the house, select every other edge using dot loop selection, and apply a collapse modifier to transition from 64 to 32 sides. The top edges also get single chamfers. Next I turn the hard ridges into cylindrical spines for the roof. I'm not sure what to call these. I create a thick cylindrical outer frame, keeping it smooth but not overly detailed. The side cylinders protruding from the roof have about 4 sides, while their outer curved ends use 8 sides. I create these cylinders separately, apply taper and bend modifiers, and use the Select and Place tool to attach them to the roof's guides. I slightly rotate them and adjust their sizes and bend angles to break symmetry. Finally, I attach the roof's skeleton to the main structure and manually refine the topology. I won't detail this process as it involves moving many parts manually with each constraint function enabled. We could keep the skeleton as a separate object, but I see no point in that. My approach takes more time, but results in a seamless, unified object. The lower part of the roof doesn't need as many sides as the top, but we still need to transition from 64 to 32 sides. Such transitions look best on flat surfaces where they don't affect the model's shading. At this stage we can apply tools like Scale to the lower part of the building within reasonable limits. I slightly stretch it vertically and marginally increase its size. Next, I soften the angles of some edges in the upper part of the building by sliding points towards each other in edge constraint mode along the Z-axis. Then I shape the ridges I mentioned earlier, ensuring they properly intersect both the outer roof frame and the roof itself. This is necessary for applying the Proboline modifier. For the frame and guides, it's crucial to make them thick enough to maintain the model's overall style. We don't want to overuse polygons, and the guides need to intersect other objects properly to enable the use of Proboline. Alternatively, we could apply a loft to each guide. For instance, if we were designing a house with a roof made of mammoth tusks that taper toward the bottom. I create caps for the lower parts of all the guides. Their centers are needed to prepare the corresponding components I mentioned earlier. I model these as curved cylinders and apply the taper tool to them. I cut out the tedious and repetitive part of the video where I adjust the properties of each curved element of the roof's skeleton. Essentially, we just want to break the symmetry and experiment with the curvature of each tusk. We can tweak the height and diameter of all cylinders, their taper modifier, and the angle of the bend modifier. Since I aligned all the cylinders to their respective tasks on the roof, I can easily adjust the curving elements by switching to the local axis. Next thing I do is remove all the unnecessary caps, attach all tasks together, attach their corresponding tips to them, and bridge them into a single object. We don't want to assign smoothing groups at this stage, since we will do it later, once our model is close to being finished. Next I move my tasks above the frame, so we don't see the frame overlapping them at any point. Finally, I apply a chamfer to the end of each rounded element and remove the extra 4 edges at their tips. Next I meticulously clean up the topology by hand. This process took about 30 minutes, and I cut it from this video because it's not particularly interesting, just using the target weld tool and manually adjusting vertices. The upper columns are created as follows. I took an 8-sided cylinder with 5 segments and offset it to the edge of the model. Then I aligned its pivot point to the center of the tower and rotated it, creating 5 copies. Next I combined the columns into a single group and applied an FFD 4x4 modifier, slightly compressing the center of the resulting shape and significantly expanding its upper part. We don't want the columns to be too delicate and elegant, but we also don't want them overly thick, as the model requires a certain elegance despite its stylization. I also created a blockout for the lower supports of the railings. The small legs have 6 sides, while the railings themselves have 12 sides. Naturally, the railing supports should be thinner than main columns. Both our lower and the top roofs have 8 ridges. We also give our railings 8 legs. There are only 6 columns though. Thinking in retrospect, we could have reduced their amount to 5. Technically, we can bend the composition the way the roof attachment point is uneven. However, I don't think we need it, since the roof itself will be uneven and bent. I decided against adding ribs to the upper roof. They would have needed to be too thin to maintain the model's delicate aesthetic, which could have clashed with the overall style. In retrospect, I think smoothing out the sharp transitions of the roof's ridges could have been a good idea. Still, I'm quite satisfied with how the model turned out. I used the same splines to create the loft for the upper roof, following the same logic as the first roof. However, the second roof has a slightly different curve. We want a subtle dome-like shape, while preserving the ocean wave stylization. I adjusted the loft's curve point and set it to smooth mode. It's important not to make this roof too thick. I ran into an issue where the roof's curve complicated its integration with the columns, so I had to work on ensuring the lower side didn't intersect with the upper one. Naturally, we want to minimize supporting edge loops while maintaining the required curvature. Ideally, polygons should be close to square in shape. Like with the first roof, we can manually adjust vertices, particularly using edge constraints. We can also compress the upper edges along the z-axis. I considered adding a curve to the upper roof with a bend modifier, but since the columns end in a flat plane, I ensured the roof had a matching flat counterpart model. Next I remade the fence supports. This time I used the bend modifier to curve the hexagonal railing supports. We could have reduced the number of sides on the upper roof, but I kept it consistent with the lower roof at 64 sides. For the fence, I created a single connection between a hexagonal support and the railing, then duplicated it by rotating it around the tower's center. I connected the resulting modules using the bridge modifier. I added a spire to the tower, reducing the polygon count threefold, from 64 to 32, then to 16, and finally to 8. If desired, we could experiment with the fence's shape, moving unsupported modules up and down. I slightly compressed the columns at their centers to give them a pleasing curve. We don't want them, or the fence and its supports, to be too thin. Next I connected all the columns and created a plane link to the tower's upper platform. Triangles are acceptable on flat surfaces, and since the model won't move or deform, we don't need to worry about shading changes during animation. Ideally, the upper roof shall be shaped so that its connections to the columns are hidden from most angles, except perhaps when viewed from directly below. We can always remove some supporting edge loops from the upper roof and insert new ones while holding Shift, allowing Max to respect the existing polygon flow. We can add new edges between existing ones and remove adjacent ones to merge two edges into one. We could linger on this face to achieve the optimal shape, as last time we compensated for some issues by adding these tusks or ridges to support the lower roof. I cut out the part of the video showing the creation of the ceiling platform supported by the upper columns. It was quite lengthy and didn't differ much from when we formed the lower platform. Essentially, I created a blockout for the fence and later refined it into a more interesting shape, accounting for the individual curves of the railing supports. As I mentioned earlier, we could have used splines to make the columns more dynamic with various lofts. In that case, we could bake high poly columns onto simpler low poly versions and add diverse details to make the house more eclectic. To avoid shading artifacts, I surrounded each intersection of the fence with its supports with a ring of near square polygons. We could apply the same approach to the thick frame running along the roof's perimeter. Then I merged all the columns into a single object and sequentially formed the lower platform, a flat plane connected to the top of the lower roof. Since this platform is flat, we can use triangles on it. The next step mirrored the process of modeling the first roof. I removed some segments of the roof's frame and connected the resulting edges to the roof itself, forming a single object. Then I combined all the objects into one unified model. Of course, if the house is only viewed from the roof side, we could leave the hidden parts empty to save on topology and UV map space. We could have kept the columns as a separate object. Also, modern game engines handle angles just fine, but I prefer sticking to the classic approach. I also noticed that the lower part of the house, its foundation, was too thin, which clashed with the model's overall look. Since we are designing the model without a bottom, and it's meant to intersect with the terrain, the foundation needs to be thick enough to accommodate potential surface irregularities. Since we are creating a prop rather than a functional house, the door won't open, and there's no interior. As such, hinges can either be painted on or omitted entirely, while the door itself is modeled directly within the doorway. We could rely on normals to depict the door, but it's better to create deep cavities around its edges to emphasize its thickness. I modeled the door handle as follows. I placed a vertex where I wanted the handle, applied a single chamfer to it, and then used the tessellate modifier on the resulting polygon, removing it to create an 8-sided edge loop. Next I used the loop regularizer script to form a circular hole for the handle. The handle itself was modeled separately using the bend modifier. I positioned it in the center of the hole using the select and place modifier, with the vertex snapping setting enabled. Avoid adding too many supporting edge loops to the handle, it doesn't need to stand out too much. The door had vertices borrowed from the pre-existing doorway cavity. I manually adjusted them to achieve a shading I was satisfied with. I also applied a single chamfer to the door, consistent with the most of the hard edges. This part of the narration is universal, so I'll repeat most of the things I've mentioned in my previous videos. When it comes to final adjustments and checks, I save my model, reset its pivot point, scale, rotation and X-form, set the pivot point to the bottom of the middle part and place it to 000 scene coordinates. Then I use the selection panel to scan my meshes for remaining angons. Technically, you can also remove balls and make sure there aren't many vertices that connect 6 or more edges. Next, I use the 3ds Max's X-View tool to scan my model for some overlapping or isolated vertices and open edges. In this case, I didn't have any isolated vertices. If there were any, I would have tried selecting them directly. If that didn't work, we'd be dealing with a classic 3ds Max bug. In such cases, I'd attach the model to a newly created box, delete the box, and then fix the model's name and pivot point. This usually resolves the issue of isolated vertices. As I've demonstrated earlier, areas where vertices aren't connected can be easily identified by switching XView to the Open Edges detection mode. Finally, I proceed to assign my smoothing groups. There's nothing special about it, but once you are done, you can also apply the weighted normals modifier to your model. Just make sure to set smoothing groups meticulously and mind that they will impact unwrapping. Normally, hard edges require corresponding UV splits for padding, but UV splits do not require hard edges. Hard edge placement is about controlling low poly smoothing behavior and baked normal gradation. UV seam placement is about optimizing usable texture space, while also limiting texture distortion. Bringing the two together is about balancing visual quality with resource efficiency. Using fewer hard edges and UV splits tends to be more resource efficient, but it's also important to make sure the final product looks good. It's generally considered best practice to strategically pair and place hard edges and UV seams along natural breaks in the shapes. Normally you can avoid sharp angles and hard edges by beveling, chamfering those edges, and going with everything smooth. It means more polygons but less drastic gradients on the low poly shading for the normal map to compensate when baked. To further improve shading on beveled low poly models, you can use weighted normals. My model doesn't have any transparent elements, so I've unwrapped it to a single 2K Resi UV map with a pixel padding of 16. That's pretty generous for this kind of a prop, especially considering the fact we use normals but don't bake anything. My model is relatively simple, so I've split my UVs according to existing hard edges and added some seams manually. Next I simply exploded all cylinders and straightened everything I could straighten in Rizom. All the columns and railing supports shall be straightened to receive any kind of stripes texture. We won't be using that for this particular model, however. At some point, we want to normalize our UV chucks and rescale some of them manually, considering their proportions in comparison to the proportions of neighboring elements. I perform manual scaling to allocate more texture space to visually prominent elements. Conversely, I reduce the size of UV chucks that will be obscured or less visible during typical use. When adjusting UV island sizes, make sure to maintain relative proportions within the same object. It's generally good practice to keep UV size variations within 20% of neighboring elements. Always scale UV islands uniformly per element. Any uneven scaling will create visible seams that Substance Painter can't fix, no matter what tricks you try. I noticed some issues with smoothing groups here. I split the corresponding UV chucks and straightened them, making a note to fix the smoothing groups in 3ds Max. I did this off camera. I unwrapped the model to ensure no overlapping UV elements. After placing all UV seams, I simply relax elements and position them horizontally or vertically depending on their location. I mostly rely on Rizom's Optimize tool, O hotkey, and also its straightening algorithm. I could have worked on the UV chunks more thoroughly to straighten them out more precisely. However, I didn't do this because I'm not using photorealistic textures that might be affected. Most stylized materials won't face such issues with my UV layout. The key is to avoid any bleeding, which is handled by our pixel padding. Strategic UV seam placement is key. We can either position them along accessible edges for easy Substance Painter repairs with the Clone Stamp tool, or hide them in less visible areas. As an added solution, switching to triplanar projection in Substance Painter typically makes most seams disappear completely. If we were making this house for a strategy game, mobile game, or a project requiring heavy optimization, I'd consider including it into a texture atlas, a part of a larger model with a 4K texture map, utilizing the space as densely as possible. Additionally, I'd think about making the model symmetrical and stacking its textures to overlap. For example, we could texture just one window model and apply the same texture to the others, or texture only one segment of each roof. When baking my model, I set the highest possible amount of raise on all tabs, disable the ID section, and switch my subsampling to 16. I've also made sure that there were no purple lines on my model or some red fragments. Also, I've selected the option to use my low poly model as a high poly one during baking. My texturing process went pretty lazy. We would get a maximum of this model if we actually hand painted it, but I mostly relied on some simple grunges. As I've mentioned earlier, I also used the free FL stylized smart material made by Fred Taylor, which is available at his ArtStation page. I'll provide the link to it in the description. It doesn't do wonders obviously, but it is really nice as a basic custom material that allows you to start playing with gradients, baked light, edge highlights, ambient occlusion and other things without making multiple own fill layers. Overall, I applied an approach similar to the one shown in the excellent video of the Stylized Station channel about texturing buildings in a Studio Ghibli-inspired style. I highly recommend checking out that video if you haven't seen it yet. Essentially, I start by creating gradients for the walls and roof segments and all other parts of the house, then layer individual grunge textures on each. Most grunge textures look too realistic, but we can easily convert them to resemble hand-painted textures by adding a blur slope filter. There is no one-size-fits-all method here. We can hand-paint the model or simulate hand-painted textures in two ways. The first method is the blur slope filter I mentioned. We can adjust the blending options for each fill layer with selected grunge textures and tweak the opacity of each layer. The second method is a relatively new tool in Substance Painter called stylization. It's great, but not particularly suited for our house model. I did end up using stylization for certain parts of this model, but not for the walls or similar elements, as converting textures into brushstroke-like effects removes a lot of detail we want to keep. However, we can successfully combine details we got from applying the blur slope filter to selected grunge textures with the brushstroke look achieved through stylization. Overall, I recommend occasionally applying stylization to see how it affects your model. Remember to block out your colors first and only bring them together when you see a reference image, a pre-made color palette, or your model in general. This is much easier than trying to match colors one by one. I've removed some parts of the video where I pick colors. It took me long enough. It is also much easier to use dark and dim colors if you are a beginner than to properly pick bright ones. Most folders were set up as follows. I created a folder with a material that fills the corresponding layer. The folder received a black mask, and I used UV chunk fill to apply it to the relevant elements. The folder contained an initial smart material and 3 grunge textures. Primarily, I used Grunge 009 for objects like walls. I also used Grunge Map 31 and the Dirt League Dry Smart Mask. Once I was satisfied with the first folder for the walls, I duplicated it several times and applied it to other objects. Naturally, I adjusted not only the colors but also the gradient ratios. In some cases, ambient occlusion was unnecessary due to interference from distant objects, so I reduced its values for those elements. Baked light was also excessive in some instances. Overall, I duplicated the initial folder multiple times, applying it to the elements I wanted to texture. Some received stylization, but only where it was appropriate. Finally, I added edge highlights, which typically enhance stylized, almost cartoonish models significantly. The general texturing approach for my house was to apply gradients to all its elements, both roofs, the walls, and even the columns. In retrospect, I think triple gradients could have been used for the lower roof and the Rotunda's dome. The pinkish highlights visible in the final render didn't come from my gradient, but from the background environment. Now that I think of it, the model could have been even softer and much more elegant if we made it lighter and pinkish pearlescent, mimicking seafoam and sunset tones. I created a near black fill layer with high roughness value to emphasize the dark outline around the door. If you want your windows and doors to glow, don't forget to assign them base colors, otherwise, when the lighting is disabled in a game or animation, you will see white patches. Make sure to periodically switch environment and lighting settings to see how your model performs under different conditions. Finally, I applied the stylization tool to some folders, set it to a hand-painted preset, and slightly increased the number of brush strokes. I think this covers everything I wanted to mention. Thanks for watching, guys. If my videos are of use to you, be my guest and subscribe to my channel for more stylized content. And most importantly, have a great day!